Hello everyone. Tonight we begin with the body, your body turned into the world's most dangerous object. Not a weapon, not a relic, but something far scarier in the eyes of ancient societies. A woman existing in blood, breath, and voice. From being banished to huts because you happened to menstruate, to being buried alive because the empire suspected you broke a vow of chastity, to having your loose hair treated like a supernatural siren, call capable of seducing angels. The history of women's bodies is less about biology and more about 1,000 little panics carved into law. And then there are the everyday absurdities. Priests declaring your touch could spoil an entire harvest. Neighbors convinced your words could hex their livestock. Or entire kingdoms debating which cousin you were legally allowed to breastfeed because milk made siblings out of strangers. Every detail of your body was a public debate, as though you weren't a person but a leaking, unpredictable portal between purity and catastrophe. So tonight, we're sinking into the strange, sometimes grotesque, sometimes hilarious taboos that wrap themselves around women's bodies in ancient societies. Silence, exile, and fear woven into daily life. Take a moment, if you like, to subscribe or leave a comment, but only if you enjoy wandering through the darker corners of history with me. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Are you curled up in bed past midnight, headphones on, or stuck on a morning commute, trying to forget you exist in a body at all? Either way, let's set the mood, lower the lights, maybe pour a cup of tea, or let the quiet hum of a fan be your background ritual. And together, let's step into a world where the simplest acts, speaking, bleeding, touching, were treated as cosmic crises. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Imagine you're born into a world where your body is treated like a ticking time bomb. Not because you can't drive yet, or because your cousin keeps asking you to help lift storage jars, but because every month you leak. Yes, that's right. Blood, the most ordinary, boringly biological event, is suddenly classified as both a health hazard and a supernatural scandal. In ancient Rome, Pliny the Elder, our favorite encyclopedia gossip columnists, swore that a menstruating woman could ruin harvests just by walking through a field, make wine turn sour just by looking at it, and drive bees mad by merely existing nearby. Picture that, you, casually sitting in the courtyard, and somewhere across the estate, a hive of bees is plotting a revolution because your uterus decided to shed its lining. That's power and pollution rolled into one. The Greeks weren't much kinder. They called menstrual blood a form of miasma, a spiritual dirtiness that spread like gossip. If a woman entered a temple mid-cycle, it wasn't just awkward, it risked angering the gods. And when the gods were angry, it wasn't the woman who suffered first. No, the entire community braced for divine side effects, crop failures, plagues, the occasional bad storm. Imagine sneezing in church today and everyone blaming you for climate change. The Hebrews had their own rules. In Leviticus, menstruating women were declared nida, ritually impure. No touching, no intimacy, no hanging around the temple like you owned the place. You were set apart, exiled, but politely. Your husband might not even sit in the same chair you used. And when it was over, a ritual bath, a total reset, as if your body had just committed a minor spiritual crime that required bureaucratic paperwork in water. And then there's India. In Vedic traditions, menstruation could push you straight into exile from sacred ritual. You weren't allowed near the fire, which was basically the heart of domestic and religious life. Try cooking, forbidden. Try praying, denied. All because your uterus had impeccable timing. The paradox was brutal. The same society that worshipped fertility as divine simultaneously treated the physical process of fertility as pollution. Here's the irony. For all the fear, menstrual blood was also whispered about as powerful. In some folk traditions, it was believed to protect crops or even enhance magical spells. A touch of it was thought to scare away demons. Some Roman texts claimed it could ward off hailstorms and banish pests. So which was it? Poison or protection? Dangerous or divine? Apparently both, depending on which priest you asked and whether his harvest looked healthy this year. The real lesson: you weren't just a woman, you were an omen. Your body was both the scapegoat for disasters and the secret ingredient in spiritual insurance policies. If the rains failed, they blamed your cycle. If the rains came, well, maybe it was thanks to your cycle. Either way, you didn't win. You simply existed in a body that the entire community treated like a nuclear reactor nobody wanted to stand too close to. And if that wasn't enough, people made rules to keep you quiet, because what if, on top of bleeding, you dared to speak? So now you're bleeding once a month, and everyone's treating you like a cursed wine barrel. But that wasn't the only taboo stapled onto your body. No, apparently the sound of your voice was dangerous too. Imagine being told, "Thanks for existing, but could you also shut up forever?" That was more or less the deal. In ancient Athens, if you were a woman, you weren't supposed to speak in the assembly, or in court, or really anywhere men were pretending to be important. The male citizen, your father, brother, or husband, was supposed to do the talking for you. You could cook, you could weave, you could bleed quietly in the corner, but speaking, no, that was a threat to democracy itself. The democracy of men, of course. Your words were treated like rogue lightning bolts, unpredictable, disruptive, too close to chaos. And it wasn't just the Greeks. In Vedic India, women's speech during rituals was considered disruptive to sacred order. The Sanskrit hymns, the mantras, had to be chanted perfectly, with mathematical precision. One syllable wrong and poof, the universe might collapse, or at least the ritual would be invalid. Now, imagine if you, a woman, dared to pipe up and mispronounce something. The whole cosmic balance at risk because your tongue slipped on a vowel. No wonder priests decided your safest contribution was silence. Even in Rome, where women were theoretically allowed to speak in certain ceremonies, the reality was tighter. A woman's lament at a funeral was considered powerful, too powerful. Her wailing could stir unrest, whip up emotions, even inspire rebellion. So laws were passed restricting public mourning by women, as if your grief might accidentally topple the republic. That's how dangerous your voice was. Grief itself became a political weapon if it came out of your mouth. The irony is that silence wasn't just about keeping the peace, it was about control. A silent woman was a managed woman. If you couldn't testify in court, you couldn't accuse your neighbor of theft. If you couldn't speak in the assembly, you couldn't challenge laws about, say, who owned your dowry. And if you couldn't wail too loudly at funerals, you couldn't rally the crowd around how unfair it all was. Your silence was the duct tape holding the patriarchy together. But don't think this silence was treated as neutral. No, it was elevated into a virtue. In Greek philosophy, the ideal woman was quiet, obedient, barely noticeable. In early Christian writings, women were instructed to learn in silence. The message was clear. Holiness had a volume knob, and for women, it was permanently set to mute. And yet, underneath all this enforced hush, people feared the opposite, that if women did speak, their words carried a kind of sorcery. A curse muttered by a woman was believed to cause illness, infertility, even death. Which means your silence wasn't just expected, it was demanded, because your tongue was suspected of being a loaded weapon. So, there you are. Your blood pollutes, your voice destabilizes, and when both appear at once, bleeding and speaking, you're practically a walking apocalypse. That's why the next step was obvious. You had to be removed, tucked away, hidden out of sight during your most dangerous times. By now you've been told your blood can sour wine and your voice can destabilize governments. What's left? Simple. Exile. Not prison, not execution. Just polite removal from polite society. Like being put on the world's most awkward vacation because your body dared to follow its biology. Take the ancient Hebrews. According to Nidda laws, once your period started, you were basically radioactive. Not only were you barred from the temple, but anything you touched, beds, chairs, clips, suddenly counted as impure too. Imagine needing a hazmat sticker just to sit on a stool. Your husband couldn't touch you without risking contamination. And if he did, he shared in your impurity like a second-hand curse. The solution: you were set apart until it ended, followed by the ritual bath that acted like a divine reset button. Mesopotamia took a slightly different tack. There, childbirth turned you into a ritual problem. Giving birth was one of the most dangerous events a woman could experience, not just medically but spiritually. The moment the baby arrived, the mother was seen as vulnerable to demons, particularly Lameshtu, a shidduchman believed to attack mothers and infants, which meant you were isolated, fumigated with incense, wrapped in protective spells, and kept apart until purification rites restored you to society. New motherhood didn't earn you pampering, it earned you temporary exile, like you were smuggling demons instead of swaddled infants. Even further afield, In parts of sub-Saharan Africa and among indigenous groups in North America, the menstrual hut was standard practice. During your cycle, you and sometimes other women were moved into a small, separate dwelling. Outsiders claimed this was for the community's protection, but it doubled as a convenient way to remind you your body was disruptive. There you sat, away from fire and food storage, out of earshot of rituals, living proof that biology could still get you kicked out of camp, and if childbirth coincided, even longer isolation, because the boundary between life and death you'd just crossed was considered too messy to mingle with daily life. It sounds harsh, but exile wasn't always cast as punishment. Sometimes it was wrapped in the language of reverence. People whispered that your state, bleeding, birthing, recovering, was liminal, perched between sacred and dangerous. They said exile wasn't rejection, it was containment, a way of quarantining your power so it didn't spill into the village and ruin the harvest, poison the water, or upset the gods, which, translated, means, please go sit in that hut until your holiness stops frightening us. Picture it, a windowless room, clay walls, straw roof, the faint smell of smoke clinging to everything. You're not allowed near fire, not allowed to cook, not allowed to share a bed. And yet, paradoxically, everyone is obsessed with your body, counting the days until you emerge purified. You don't disappear. You loom, even in absence. Your exile reminding the whole community that female biology isn't just private, it's public, cosmic, and constantly policed. And when you do return, cleansed and reabsorbed, it isn't freedom, it's surveillance resumed. Because the rules don't end with exile, they extend into the sacred spaces you're now allowed back into, where purity and pollution still decide who gets to stand where. So you've finally crawled out of exile, scrubbed clean, declared pure enough to rejoin society. But don't get too comfortable. The next question isn't whether you can sit at the fire again, it's whether the gods want you anywhere near their front door. In ancient Japan, for example, Shinto shrines were strict about menstrual exclusion. Women on their period were forbidden from entering the sacred grounds, because their bodies were thought to disrupt the delicate boundary between humans and Kamitha, divine spirits. Picture yourself trudging to a shrine, only to be stopped by a priest who takes one look at your face, guesses what time of the month it is, and politely waves you back toward the rice fields. The gods didn't want your prayers if you were leaking. In the Andean world, among the Inca temple, access was similarly policed. Certain sacred sites, especially those tied to fertility rituals, banned menstruating women from participation. The logic was stunningly contradictory. Women embodied fertility, yet menstruation was read as an inverted, dangerous fertility. You could give life, yes, but bleed at the wrong time, and suddenly your presence threatened to offend the mountain deities who controlled water and crops. Think of it as a cosmic scheduling error. Show up with the wrong biological timing, and you were a hazard to agriculture. Even in West Africa, among Yoruba religious practices, taboos circled women's ritual roles. Priestesses could hold enormous spiritual authority, yet menstruation still clipped their wings. During their cycle, they were barred from handling ritual objects or entering the Oriya shrines. Imagine holding the title of spiritual leader, only to be benched every few weeks because your body was accused of scaring off the very deities you served. The theme repeats across continents. Temples were the beating hearts of ancient societies, and women's bodies were considered unstable enough to jeopardize that rhythm. Pollution, impurity, danger. It wasn't just social, it was cosmic. A single step into sacred space at the wrong time could, in theory, derail the gods' favor, the kingdom's fortune, or at least the priesthood's peace of mind. And yet, let's be honest, the ban said more about control than about divine preference. After all, when the gods supposedly made everything, the rivers, the floods, the harvests, did they really tremble at the thought of one bleeding woman crossing a threshold? Or was it that men with incense and power were terrified of a body they couldn't schedule, silence, or entirely explain? So you stood outside the sacred doors, waiting for your body to align with ritual timetables, knowing full well that the temple didn't just keep the gods safe from you, it kept society safe from what you might represent if you walked inside on your own terms. And once you were finally allowed in, purified, decorated, carefully monitored, you quickly learned that what the temple really feared wasn't your absence of purity, but your abundance of presence. And that abundance, oh, it showed most clearly in the one thing every culture tried hardest to hide: your hair. You've been exiled, purified, kept outside temples like a stray dog. And just when you think your body can't possibly be policed any further, surprise, they come for your hair. Yes, that boring stuff on your head, the one thing you thought you could grow in peace. Turns out, ancient societies looked at women's hair and saw chaos incarnate. Let's start in ancient Israel. In Numbers 5, during the so-called ordeal of jealousy, a woman accused of adultery had her hair uncovered and loosened before being paraded through ritual humiliation. Why? Because loose hair screamed disorder, sexuality, rebellion. Your hair wasn't just strands, it was a symbol of your moral status. If it fell out of place, people assumed you had to imagine your bangs slipping forward in the wind, and everyone deciding that was proof of infidelity. In Assyria, elite women were actually required to veil in public, while prostitutes and slaves were forbidden from doing so. Veils weren't just fashion, they were social armor. To go uncovered if you were respectable was scandalous. To cover if you weren't was a crime. So your hair became a billboard announcing your rank, your morality, and whether the gods approved of your existence. Forget Tinder bios. One glimpse of your head covering told the world everything they thought they needed to know about you. Travel east to China, and hair carried an entirely different but equally suffocating symbolism. Confucian codes emphasized the idea that your hair was a gift from your parents and shouldn't be cut carelessly. For women, this meant elaborate styles that proclaimed obedience and family honor. But the unbound hair of a woman in mourning or madness was feared an omen of disorder, a physical manifesto that something had gone cosmically wrong. You could say your loose bun was basically an apocalypse announcement. Even among early Christians in the Mediterranean, Paul's letters urged women to cover their hair in worship. Why? Because it was considered sexually tempting, not to you, of course, but to angels. Yes, apparently celestial beings with eternal wisdom could still be derailed by the sight of your curls. Think of the absurdity. A woman bows her head in prayer, and an immortal winged entity is suddenly distracted like a teenager with a Wi-Fi connection. Hair, then, was never just hair. It was a spiritual hazard, a moral declaration, a flashing red light announcing temptation, chaos, danger. Societies insisted it be bound, veiled, hidden, controlled into shapes that pleased men and gods alike. The message was simple. Your scalp was a holy battlefield, and every strand had geopolitical consequences. So you learned to tame it, pin it, smother it in cloth. Not because you wanted to, but because if you didn't, someone would read your loose braid as a cosmic rebellion. Or worse, an open invitation to the supernatural. And if your hair could already unravel the world, imagine what they thought about pregnancy, the one time your body became too visibly untamable to ignore. So, your hair has been veiled, bound, and practically accused of seducing angels. But at some point, society looks past your head and notices what's happening further south. Pregnancy, the great paradox. Suddenly, you're sacred and polluting at the same time, a walking miracle wrapped in ritual red tape. Take ancient Egypt. Pregnancy was a state so precarious that spells and amulets were your best prenatal care. Women wore ivory wands etched with protective demons, like base, to ward off evil forces. Midwives muttered incantations to protect you from spirits thought to lurk in the birthing chamber. And yet, while everyone revered the promise of new life, your swollen belly also marked you as ritually dangerous. Temples barred you. Priests kept their distance. You were both a vessel of continuity and a potential contamination hazard. In the Hittite world of Anatolia, childbirth was explicitly framed as pollution. After delivery, a mother underwent strict purification rites before she could return to the household or sacred spaces. For days, sometimes weeks, you were kept apart, as though your contact with blood and new life had stained you in ways only ritual fire and water could undo. It wasn't your fault, of course. It was simply the price of producing heirs. Imagine, you've just done the hardest work of your life, and instead of a parade, you get treated like you've spilled something toxic on the cosmic carpet. Among the Aztecs in Mesoamerica, pregnancy and childbirth were revered as the female equivalent of battle. A woman who died in childbirth was honored like a fallen warrior, her soul believed to join the sun on its daily journey. Sounds empowering, right? Except during the actual process, the birthing woman was considered ritually dangerous, liminal, balanced between life and death. Special rituals kept her isolated, her blood feared as potent enough to disrupt order. She could ascend to near divinity, but not without being first marked as polluting. Even in Zoroastrian Persia, pregnant women required protection not only from evil spirits, but from their own state of impurity. Ritual manuals describe elaborate precautions, keeping fires burning, prayers recited, and strict limits on her movement until purification rituals restored balance. Your body was a battlefield between sacred life and unclean forces, and the community treated you as though demons had filed a lease inside your womb. The irony here is staggering. Pregnancy was exalted in every myth as the continuation of lineage, the foundation of society, the proof of divine favor. And yet, the reality was that once you were visibly pregnant, you became untouchably tuuli, a sacred vessel. Yes, but one leaking danger, bound in rules, encircled by fear. Revered, but quarantined. Celebrated, but silenced. So you carried life, yes, but you also carried suspicion. And when that life finally emerged, screaming, squirming, reminding everyone how fragile it all really was, the taboos didn't end. They only shifted, wrapping around the next bodily function society loved to fear: breastfeeding. So, you've birthed a child under the watch of demons, priests, and enough incense to fumigate an empire. Now the baby is in your arms, and you think finally this should be simple. Feed the child, keep it alive. But of course, your body can't just provide milk. It has to come with 1,000 restrictions, suspicions, and whispered taboos. Let's start in ancient Rome. Medical writers, like Soranus, had entire treatises on the subject. They warned husbands against sexual contact with nursing women, not because anyone cared about your comfort, but because they thought intercourse could spoil the milk. Picture this: you're just trying to nurse, and meanwhile men are debating whether their advances might literally curdle what comes out of your breast. The baby's health, it seems, depended less on hygiene and more on your husband's ability to restrain himself for a few months. In the Islamic world of early Arabia, breastfeeding became entwined with kinship itself. Milk kinship laws declared that if 2 children were suckled by the same woman, they were considered siblings and forbidden to marry. Your milk, then, wasn't just nutrition, it was a legal substance that redrew family trees. Imagine burping a baby and simultaneously redrafting the inheritance rights of an entire clan. One drop of your body's fluid could alter the marriage market forever. Across parts of sub-Saharan Africa, taboos restricted what a nursing mother could eat. Among the Kikuyu, for example, certain foods were avoided because they were thought to sour the milk or harm the child's health. So while everyone else at the feast tucked into roasted goat, you picked carefully at the millet, knowing one wrong bite might earn you blame for your baby's colic. Your stomach wasn't just yours anymore. It was a public concern, a monitored diet for the sake of cosmic equilibrium. And in medieval Europe, breastfeeding taboos had their own twist. Aristocratic women often handed infants over to wet nurses, but wet nurses themselves were micromanaged, forbidden from eating garlic, onions, or anything too heavy for fear the taste would pass into the milk. A noble baby's future apparently hinged on whether his nurse enjoyed stew. The irony: the biological mother's milk was treated as sacred, but the poor woman actually feeding the infant was lectured like a kitchen servant with the wrong spice rack. The common thread is striking. Milk, the first food of humanity, was never just food. It was law, taboo, ritual, and suspicion. Your breasts weren't soft or maternally, they were bureaucratic offices, dispensing fluids that redrew social lines and redefined purity. A feeding woman was both revered and restricted, a living symbol of nourishment whose diet, behavior, and sexuality were watched like she was handling explosives. And when that milk dried up, the next trial began. Because if breastfeeding left you half sacred and half policed, childbirth itself, the act that started it all, was where society really went to town with its fears. So you've followed every food taboo, avoided garlic for the baby's sake, and managed to keep your milk politically acceptable. But none of that compares to childbirth itself, the grand performance where your body turns into a stage for cosmic terror. In the ancient world, giving birth wasn't just medical, it was ritual, and everyone treated you like you were halfway between miracle and disaster. In ancient Greece, childbirth was seen as a pollution event. Women who delivered were considered ritually unclean, requiring purification before they could touch sacred objects or participate in festivals. Even their husbands had to avoid them until purification rites were completed. Imagine it: you've just pushed a human out of your body, and your first reward is a spiritual quarantine. as if you've returned from the underworld carrying dangerous souvenirs. Among the Babylonians, childbirth was a cosmic showdown. Evil forces, especially the demoness Lamashtu, were believed to stalk birthing rooms, eager to harm mother and child. To counter this, protective amulets and incantations filled the space, summoning spirits like Pazuzu, grotesque demon with wings and a lion's face to scare off worse demons. Yes, they fought evil with more evil, turning your labor into a supernatural cage match while you screamed on the sidelines. Head to the Andes, and childbirth took on another eerie role. For the Inca, blood spilled during delivery was seen as liminal, carrying both fertility and danger. Special attendants ensured that none of it contaminated sacred spaces. Afterward, the mother underwent cleansing rituals to reset her body and remove the impurity of birth. You gave life, yes, but until ritual cleaned you up, society treated you as if you were still trailing death in your wake. Among indigenous groups in North America, like the Navajo, childbirth was understood through ceremony too. Birth happened in carefully prepared spaces, with ritual songs guiding the process and sacred sand paintings drawn to protect mother and child. But even here, the event marked a dangerous crossing. Mother and infant were shielded not only from physical threats, but from spiritual contamination, as if the act of opening the body invited both life and unwelcome spirits. The pattern is clear. Across continents, childbirth wasn't framed as ordinary yet, was apocalyptic. Your body, swollen and trembling, became a battlefield for gods, demons, ancestors, and cosmic balance. People whispered prayers, burned incense, tied amulets, and sprinkled sacred water, not because they doubted your strength, but because they doubted the world's ability to handle what your body was doing. And when the ordeal was over, when the child's cry finally pierced the air, you weren't congratulated like a modern athlete who crossed the finish line. You were marked. You'd spilled blood, crossed thresholds, touched chaos. Rituals were required to scrub you back into the social order, as if your body had flirted too closely with powers no one else wanted to acknowledge. And yet, even after purification, the suspicion lingered, because childbirth didn't end the fear, it only shifted it to the everyday danger of your touch. So, you've survived childbirth, survived the amulets, the incense, the demons pacing your bedside. You've been ritually scrubbed back into society. But here's the catch. Even when you're pure, your body is still treated like a suspicious object. Specifically, your hands touch the wrong thing, and the whole community panics like you've just set off an invisible alarm. In ancient Rome, Pliny the Elder, our favorite collector of supernatural gossip, claimed that a menstruating woman's touch could spoil wine, turn crops barren, and even cause mirrors to darken. Imagine reaching for a cup of wine at dinner, only to have the host yank it back like you're about to hex the vintage. Your fingertips were accused of being tiny weapons, capable of ruining harvests or rusting metal just by brushing against them. Among the Hittites of Anatolia, postpartum women were treated like walking contagion. After childbirth, if you so much as touched food, it was considered contaminated until purification rituals were complete. Touching water could defile it. Touching sacred objects could anger the gods. The message was clear. Keep your hands to yourself until the priests give you the cosmic alt. In parts of Polynesia, tapu laws regulated women's touch in ways that blurred the line between sacred and forbidden. Menstruating women were prohibited from touching food meant for communal feasts, or from handling tools used in ritual. Their touch wasn't just avoided, it was marked as taboo in the deepest sense of the word, fusing social law with cosmic law. Your hands weren't seen as yours. They were instruments that might accidentally rearrange the universe if you picked up the wrong basket. In Zoroastrian Persia, the rules got even more elaborate. Menstruating women were kept separate from sacred fire, water, and even sunlight. Touching these forces directly was said to pollute them, requiring long purification rituals to restore balance. Imagine being told you couldn't touch sunlight, as if standing near a window during your cycle might dim the cosmic light bulb. That was the level of paranoia attached to your body. And yet, for all these restrictions, there was an odd respect buried inside the fear. The idea that your touch could spoil crops, sour wine, or disrupt fire also implied that your body was powerful enough to interact with the deepest layers of the world. Ordinary hands couldn't ruin a vineyard. Yours supposedly could, which made you both dangerous and indispensable, feared and needed, revered and exiled. So every gesture was monitored, every brush of the hand politicized. You weren't just asked to avoid touching sacred objects, you were told your very skin carried consequences. And if the touch of your hand was suspect, you can imagine what people thought about the far more intimate parts of your body, the ones tied directly to sexuality itself. By now, your hair has been veiled, your milk supervised, your touch practically criminalized. But the real battlefield isn't your scalp or your fingertips, it's your sexuality. In the ancient imagination, your desire was radioactive, feared, hidden, regulated, and yet secretly envied for its ability to bend men, crops, and kingdoms. Take ancient Mesopotamia. Female sexuality was wrapped in paradox. On one hand, the sacred prostitutes of Ishtar's temples embodied divine power. Their bodies were seen as conduits between mortals and gods, a ritual necessity for cosmic balance. But outside that controlled space, ordinary women's sexuality was branded dangerous, destabilizing. Adultery, even suspected, was punished brutally, sometimes by drowning, sometimes by ritual humiliation. Your body was holy when supervised by priests, but criminal when supervised by yourself. In early China, Confucian codes placed strict rules around female sexuality, tying it to family honor. A woman's chastity was framed as the foundation of social order. Violate it, and you weren't just personally disgraced, you polluted your lineage. Whole households could be shamed, not because of theft or murder, but because of one clandestine affair. Your body was recast as a vault for family virtue, sealed tight, monitored like state property. Among the Aztecs, female sexuality outside marriage was seen as a threat to society's stability. Virginity was prized, adultery punished with stoning or strangulation. Yet, at the same time, fertility goddesses were depicted as voluptuous, overflowing with erotic power. The contradiction was glaring. Women's sexual energy was revered in myth, but in flesh it was feared, legislated, and brutally punished. In Jewish law, the concept of ritual impurity extended even to sex within marriage. Intercourse during menstruation was forbidden, considered defiling both partners. The irony is delicious. The very act that secured lineage and survival could also stain you spiritually, depending on the calendar. Love itself had a schedule, and if you miscalculated, you weren't just breaking a rule, you were threatening cosmic balance. And in parts of West Africa, sexuality was often framed through spiritual danger. Among the Dogon, for example, menstrual blood and uncontrolled female desire were linked to disorder in the community. Male initiation rituals were designed, in part, to protect men from the destabilizing power of women's sexuality. Your body wasn't just yours, it was cast as a storm men needed shields against. The absurdity runs deep. Your sexuality was powerful enough to topple families, kingdoms, maybe even gods, and so it was locked down, contained, monitored. You were both the poison and the cure, the risk and the ritual. Your body was blamed for disorder, yet sought out as the source of life. And if your sexuality could unbalance the cosmos, then imagine the chaos people feared when you brushed against death itself. If your sexuality could destabilize kingdoms, death took things to an entirely different stage. Because once grief entered the room, your body wasn't just suspected, was considered downright dangerous. Your tears, your cries, even the way you moved in mourning were thought to summon chaos. Imagine being told not only how to live, but how to grieve. Among the ancient Egyptians, death rituals were carefully orchestrated public theater, and women's role in mourning was tightly policed. Professional mourners, often women, were hired to wail, beat their chests, and embody grief on behalf of the community. But here's the irony. While their performance was necessary to help the dead cross into the afterlife, it was also feared. Excessive wailing was seen as disruptive, even risky, potentially attracting unwanted spirits. Your voice in mourning was required and reviled at the same time. In early Judaism, women were expected to mourn, but their impurity laws added another layer. A menstruating or postpartum woman was already considered impure. Combine that with the impurity of touching or being near the dead, and suddenly your presence at a funeral could double the contamination. Imagine walking into a mourning house and everyone calculating whether you were about to break the ritual system twice over. The Romans had their own anxieties. Women were notorious, they said, for excessive lamentation, so legislation restricted their presence at funerals, banning loud crying, tearing hair, or scratching cheeks to dramatically not because the state cared about your feelings, but because your grief could be read as a political act. Too much noise, too much passion, and suddenly the crowd wasn't thinking about the deceased, they were thinking about rebellion. Your tears could stir revolt, and that made your body a security risk. Among the Yoruba in West Africa, female mourners were essential, but also carefully controlled. Wailing women were seen as the bridge between the living and the ancestors, their cries helping the dead transition. But their bodies in mourning were seen as vulnerable, liminal, too close to the world of spirits. So, after funerals, purification rites often followed, as if grief had left a residue on your skin that needed to be washed away before you contaminated the household. Even in early Christianity, Paul's letters warned against women leading public mourning rituals, reinforcing the idea that their voices and bodies could throw communities into disorder. The widow weeping at the edge of the grave wasn't just pitied, she was feared, as if her cries might accidentally rewrite doctrine. So there you stood, draped in black eyes, red, chest heaving. The community demanded you grieve, demanded you embody sorrow, demanded you weep loudly enough to honor the dead, yet not too loudly, not too freely, not too much. Your grief was a performance with strict rules, because even in mourning, your body was too powerful to leave unsupervised. And if your voice in sorrow was policed this carefully, you can imagine how seriously they took your voice in ordinary life, your oaths, your curses, the words you weren't supposed to speak at all. So far, your voice has been hushed in assemblies, muffled in temples, restricted in funerals. But the fear didn't stop there. Even your ordinary speech was considered suspicious, and when it came to curses or oaths, people treated your tongue like it was loaded with live ammunition. Imagine not being allowed to speak freely because someone decided your casual muttering could kill goats. In ancient Mesopotamia, the spoken curse was treated like a weapon. Women's words were feared to carry illness, infertility, and misfortune, particularly in the household. If a quarrel escalated and you let something sharp slip from your mouth, people genuinely believed it might lodge itself into the crops or the wombs of your enemies. A woman's curse wasn't just gossip, it was spiritual artillery, which meant your words had to be monitored, or better yet, silenced, before you accidentally hexed the livestock. In early Germanic societies, oaths taken by women were treated with suspicion. A man's oath might bind property or allegiance. A woman's oath was considered less binding, but paradoxically more dangerous if broken. The logic went, if you swore falsely, the gods might punish not just you, but your kin. So, your promise could doom an entire household. Imagine raising your right hand and suddenly being accused of gambling with the survival of your whole family. Among the Maori in New Zealand, women's curses kangawa, feared for their spiritual potency. A curse uttered by a woman was believed to bring real consequences, from illness to social disgrace. Oral tradition is filled with tales of women whose angry words carried the weight of ancestral authority, reshaping disputes and even shifting political power. Your curse wasn't just speech, it was treated as though it came stamped with divine approval. Even in medieval Europe, women's words were criminalized under witchcraft accusations. Whispered charms, muttered complaints, or simply being too sharp-tongued could be reframed as evidence of sorcery. If a neighbor's cow died after you argued about a fence, guess who everyone thought cursed it? Spoiler, not the man who built the fence. Your curse became the scapegoat explanation for every stubbed toe and spoiled churn of butter. The absurd double standard is obvious. Your words were considered too flimsy to count in court, too unreliable for politics, too hysterical for philosophy. Yet, the same people turned around and claimed your muttered curse could topple harvests, marriages, and kingdoms. You were silenced for your weakness and feared for your strength. Speech became the most policed part of your body, second only to the blood it occasionally spilled. And because of that, purification wasn't just about scrubbing away blood or birth, it was about scrubbing away your voice too. Which is why the next great obsession wasn't what you said, but how society could ritually reset you after daring to exist in your body. By now, every part of you has been treated like a hazardous material. Your blood, your hair, your grief, even your muttered words. So how did ancient societies handle this ongoing panic? With purification, of course. Elaborate, exhausting, repetitive cleansing rituals designed not so much to clean your body as to clean everyone else's conscience about living near it. In ancient Judaism, the mikveh ritual bath became central to women's lives. After menstruation, after childbirth, after sex, you were expected to immerse in living water before you could return to ordinary duties. It wasn't about hygiene. You could be spotless and still counted as impure. Only ritual immersion reset you, like pressing the cosmic restart button. Imagine stepping into a cold pool while neighbors nodded approvingly, convinced the divine plumbing system had just flushed away your contamination. In Mesopotamia, purification often took the form of fumigation. Women after childbirth or miscarriage were smoked with aromatic herbs and incense to banish ritual pollution. Think of it as an ancient dry cleaning service for your soul. Stand there, choke on the fumes, and wait until priests declared you breathable again. Among the Hindus, Asharcha rules dictated strict periods of impurity following birth, miscarriage, or menstruation. Families followed seclusion practices, with women confined and later ritually cleansed before rejoining the household. Bathing, fasting, and offerings to the gods punctuated the transition. Your body was seen as so cosmically messy that only a sequence of spiritual paperwork signed in water, smoke, and prayer could restore order. In Shinto Japan, purification was built into the rhythm of life. Women, like men, underwent rituals of hare, purification after contact with what was deemed impure, including blood. Waterfalls, rivers, and shrine basins weren't just refreshing, they were checkpoints for re-entering the sacred. Every dip reminded you that the gods weren't afraid of dirt, they were afraid of you. And in early Christianity, echoes persisted. Women after childbirth were expected to undergo churching, a blessing and purification ritual before re-entering liturgical life. The ceremony thanked God for safe delivery, but carried the undertone of wiping away impurity. In practice, it treated new mothers like they'd been wandering outside holiness until the church pulled them back inside with a prayer. What these rituals all reveal is that impurity wasn't about hygiene, it was about boundaries. Your body blurred to many of them: life and death, sacred and profane, clean and unclean. Purification was the cultural duct tape, holding the categories together, resetting you again and again, even though you'd only done what biology required. So, dunked, smoked, blessed, and bathed, you re-entered the world, your body temporarily reclassified as safe. But don't get too confident, because even when you were ritually cleansed, society kept its eye on you, reserving its rarest exception for women in the priesthood. And that exception came with rules so suffocating they made purification look like recess. So, after being bathed, smoked, and dunked like a divine teabag, you're allowed back into society. But here's the twist. In some cultures, women weren't just included, they were elevated into sacred office. Priestesses, oracles, guardians of temples. Sounds empowering, right? Don't get too excited, because the only way you got access to that kind of authority was by surrendering almost every aspect of your body to regulation. Take the Vestal Virgins of Rome. Chosen as children, sworn to 30 years of service, their entire identity hinged on one thing: absolute chastity. They kept the sacred fire of Vesta burning, the hearth of Rome itself, and the city believed its survival depended on their purity. Slip up even once, and you weren't just shamed. You were buried alive, sealed in an underground chamber with a flicker of food and water, so the state could claim it hadn't technically killed you. Imagine being a teenage girl in charge of an empire's cosmic gas bill, knowing one mistake meant suffocating under several tons of dirt. Shift to ancient Greece, and you find the Pythia, priestess of Apollo at Delphi. She had unparalleled authority, her transborn prophecies guiding kings and wars. Yet her body was heavily managed, celibacy was enforced, diets were controlled, and her oracular sessions took place only under strict ritual conditions. Even her words were filtered, interpreted by male priests before they reached the public. You might have been the mouth of Apollo, but your voice still needed a male editor. In India, Devadasis, women dedicated to temple service, occupied a complicated role. On the surface, they were honored, adorned, and trained in ritual and art. Yet their sexuality was often corrupted by temple hierarchies, bound to serve gods, and, by extension, the powerful men managing those gods' earthly estates. Your sacred status was inseparable from institutional control of your body, down to when and how you performed, sang, or were given in ritual marriage to deities. In West Africa, among the Yoruba priestesses of the Ororat wielded spiritual authority, sometimes even surpassing their male counterparts. Yet here too, taboos hemmed them in. Menstruating priestesses were barred from shrines, their bodies treated as interruptions to ritual flow. Authority existed, yes, but only on a calendar. Society dictated your power was divine, except when biology made you temporarily radioactive. The theme never changes. Sacred power for women came with conditions, so suffocating that it felt less like privilege and more like house arrest in a temple. To be holy, you had to strip your body of autonomy. No sex, no family, no unsupervised choices. Your divinity was institutional property, your every action logged in the ledgers of priests and kings. And if priestesses lived with that level of scrutiny, imagine what happened to ordinary women with no temple title to shield them. They didn't just face rules, they inherited the long-term legacy of taboos that branded their bodies as cosmic liabilities. So here you are, after centuries of exile huts, purification baths, veils, restrictions, and priestly micromanagement. You'd think, by now, people would have calmed down about women's bodies, but the legacy of those ancient taboos didn't vanish. They simply shapeshifted, leaving fingerprints on laws, rituals, and quiet habits that outlived the empires that invented them. Take medieval Europe. The Church carried forward purity laws from Judaism, packaging them neatly into canon law. Women were barred from the altar during menstruation, excluded from certain sacraments, and quietly churched after childbirth to cleanse their supposed impurity. The same old story. Biological events turned into bureaucratic problems, solved by dunking, blessing, or exclusion. In Japan, echoes of Shinto purity rules still ripple. Shrines into the modern era kept prohibitions against menstruating women entering sacred areas. Some restrictions remain today, lingering as cultural discomfort, as if the kami are still skittish about blood. In Hindu practice, taboos around menstruation persist, particularly in rural areas. Women may be barred from kitchens, temples, and beds during their cycles. The ancient Vedic logic that bleeding marks a dangerous liminality is alive, repackaged as tradition. Entire households still reorganize themselves around a body they can neither ignore nor fully accept. And in Islam, purity codes shaped by ancient precedent exclude menstruating women from prayer and fasting obligations. Here too, the body isn't just private, it's written into the calendar of the sacred, turned into a cosmic schedule everyone has to follow. Even beyond religion, cultural residues linger. Hair coverings survive in many traditions as symbols of modesty, echoing the old fear that loose hair equals loose morals. Rules about women's speech echo in societies where female testimony remains legally undervalued, and the obsession with purity, chastity, and silence. Those threads run directly back to the ancient scripts carved on clay, papyrus, and stone. The cruel genius of these taboos is how they worked both ways. They exalted women as sacred vessels and condemned them as cosmic hazards. They treated the female body as necessary but unbearable, life-giving but contaminating. And that contradiction never really resolved. It just dressed itself in new clothes for each era. So if you had been born into one of those ancient societies, you wouldn't have simply lived in your body. You would have carried it like a public monument, constantly monitored, ritually reset, feared and needed in equal measure. And the strangest part, long after the priests, the temples, and the empires collapsed, the taboos kept breathing, folded into tradition, whispering in law, muttering through generations, until they reached us, still smelling faintly of incense and fear. Menstrual blood has always been a terrible multitasker. It could poison crops, repel demons, ruin wine, protect against storms, and, in some accounts, summon fertility itself. The absurdity was that the same fluid could be treated as both deadly contamination and holy insurance policy, depending on who was holding the incense burner that day. Ancient observers catalogued its supposed dangers with obsessive detail. In the Roman world, Pliny the Elder compiled a list of claims, so dramatic it read less like natural history and more like the script of a supernatural horror play. According to him, menstrual blood could corrode iron, make bees abandon their hives, drive dogs mad, and kill seedlings with a single touch. A vineyard could collapse into ruin if a woman in her cycle wandered too close. To modern eyes, it sounds ridiculous, But in Pliny's universe, this wasn't comedy. It was evidence that female biology held destructive potential on par with curses. The Greeks echoed the theme in a different key, couching it in the concept of miasma, ritual pollution. Menstruation wasn't filth in the everyday sense, it was cosmic disorder, the kind of contamination that seeped into rituals and unsettled the gods. A menstruating woman stepping into a temple was not merely unwelcome. She risked destabilizing the delicate balance between mortals and divine. And once the gods were unsettled, everyone suffered. Crops failed, sickness spread, cities faltered. One woman's cycle was stretched into a collective cosmic liability. But here's where the story swerves. The same blood, feared as destructive, was also treated as a source of uncanny power. Roman accounts insist that it could repel pests, ward off hailstorms, and protect fields from infestation. Folklore in several regions gave it a role as an ingredient in protective charms, a kind of biological talisman. If used correctly, menstrual blood could keep evil spirits at bay. It wasn't just pollution, it was potential. The line between danger and blessing was razor-thin, depending on who got to define it. Anthropologists often note that this contradiction wasn't a misunderstanding of biology. It was about boundaries. Menstrual blood marked the body as liminal, suspended between fertility and loss, creation and death. It was a reminder that women's bodies occupied thresholds the rest of society couldn't easily categorize. And ancient societies hated thresholds. They demanded order, separation, definition. Anything that blurred categories, blood outside the body, women outside the home, words outside silence, was treated as threatening. So menstrual blood became a paradox that demanded rules. It was dangerous enough to exile women from fields, kitchens, and temples, sacred enough to whisper into spells and charms. Always powerful, never neutral, the body could not be ignored. It had to be contained, explained, managed through ritual and taboo. And if the Mediterranean world gave menstrual blood its horror movie reputation, other cultures codified that tension into law, drawing up precise instructions on how long a woman should be exiled, what objects she could touch, and how she should be purified afterward. The Europeans didn't merely inherit the paradox of menstrual blood, it staged it, like a public performance. Greeks and Romans alike agreed that something about this monthly cycle was both indispensable and catastrophic. It was treated not as biology, but as a constant referendum on cosmic order. Greek medicine tried to make sense of it, though sense is generous. Hippocratic writers claimed menstruation was a way for women to purge excess blood, a natural cleansing to balance humors. But this cleansing was framed like a leaky sewer pipe, necessary, but unspeakably unpleasant. Aristotle went further, describing women as colder and weaker versions of men, with menstruation as proof of their biological deficiency. It was philosophy disguised as physiology, turning half the population into permanent reminders of imperfection. The religious language was sharper. Menstrual blood was linked to miasma, a pollution that didn't stop at skin level. A woman in her cycle risked transmitting disorder by stepping into sacred space. Priests and philosophers both repeated that her presence during sacrifice could disrupt communication with the gods, as though her body was static on a divine radio channel. Purity codes weren't metaphorical. They dictated access, temple doors closed, rituals postponed, prayers delayed until her blood stopped. Rome amplified these anxieties with an enthusiasm only Rome could manage. Pliny the Elder, that tireless collector of marvels, turned menstruation into a list of civic hazards. Wine soured at the glance of a menstruating woman. Seed corn became sterile if touched. Bees abandoned hives. Dogs went rabid. Iron rusted. Even mirrors clouded. It was less medicine than mythology, yet Pliny wrote it as fact. He was archiving cultural panic, the fear that female biology might unravel society one glass of spoiled wine at a time. Yet the Romans couldn't decide whether menstrual blood was curse or cure. In the same breath, Pliny claimed it could ward off storms, drive away pests, and even protect crops if spread in fields. A woman's body was toxic waste in one paragraph and divine pesticide in the next. The contradiction was never resolved because it was never meant to be. The point wasn't truth, it was control. If blood could be called dangerous or protective at will, then rules about women's behavior could shift as needed. Archaeological evidence shows that exclusion from temples and public rituals was not occasional but systematic. Women were restricted, not because their presence was irrelevant, but because it was too relevant. The cycle reminded everyone that creation and decay were happening inside bodies society couldn't regulate. And so priests, philosophers, and magistrates invented stories about spoiled wine and sulking bees to make regulations sound inevitable. In this world, menstruation wasn't just a private event, it was politics in blood form. Every cycle was another excuse to exile, exclude, or redefine what counted as purity. Mediterranean society built entire categories of law and ritual around it. And those laws spread, carried into scriptures, customs, and eventually into religions that still echo the same themes. But if the Greeks and Romans gave menstruation its catalogue of terrors, the Hebrews turned it into a full legal code, one of the earliest and most detailed attempts to legislate the body in sacred terms. If the Mediterranean world gave menstruation a mythology, the Hebrews gave it paperwork. The laws of Nida, preserved in Leviticus, turned a biological cycle into a full legal schedule, complete with restrictions, prohibitions, and purification requirements. It was one of the earliest codified systems for managing menstruation, and it left nothing to chance. The rule was clear. A menstruating woman was ritually impure for 7 days. Anything she touched became impure, whether it was a chair, a bed, or a clay vessel. Anyone who touched her, or touched something she had touched, inherited that impurity. In practical terms, she was transformed into a walking source of contamination, an unintentional broadcaster of sacred static. It wasn't simply about avoiding her, it was about avoiding anything in her gravitational field. Intimacy, naturally, was banned. A husband was forbidden from approaching his wife during her cycle, with penalties that stretched from ritual impurity to, in later interpretations, outright sin. Sexual abstinence wasn't a suggestion, but a divine command, folded into the rhythms of family life. The household reorganized itself around her cycle, as if her body carried an invisible calendar dictating the pace of the sacred. And yet, impurity in this context didn't mean sin. It wasn't moral failure, but ritual category error. Menstruation was grouped with other bodily discharges, childbirth, even contact with corpses, all reminders of life and death that unsettled the fragile boundaries of the sacred. The body that bled was liminal, caught between fertility and loss, creation and decay. The law didn't punish her for this liminality, it quarantined it. The end of the cycle required resolution. The woman had to undergo immersion in a mikveh, a ritual bath fed by living water rivers, springs, or specially constructed pools. Only then was she declared pure again, able to return to sexual intimacy and temple life. The bath wasn't hygiene, it was cosmic reset. Without it, the impurity lingered, a shadow in the household and the community. This legal framework did something profound. It made menstruation not only a private matter but a public concern. The cycle was no longer an unpredictable bodily rhythm. It was woven into the sacred calendar. Purity laws turned biology into law, law into ritual, and ritual into identity. The female body became a constant reminder of the need to separate, cleanse, and purify, a theology written in blood. And while the Hebrew codes were unusually detailed, they weren't unique. Across South Asia, early Vedic traditions developed their own system of taboos, banning menstruating women from kitchens, fire rituals, and shrines. The same logic held. Bleeding blurred the categories, and blurred categories needed containment. In South Asia, menstruation wasn't just a matter of ritual inconvenience, it was a seismic event for the household. The early Vedic texts treated it with the same suspicion reserved for fire gone out of control, necessary in principle, but catastrophic if handled without rules. The result was a system of taboos that folded menstruating women into a space apart, neither fully included nor entirely excluded, suspended in ritual quarantine. The restrictions were detailed. Women were forbidden from approaching the hearth fire, which was considered the center of both domestic and cosmic order. To touch it while bleeding was to risk destabilizing, not just the household, but the sacred link between humans and the gods. The same logic applied to shrines. Menstruating women were kept at a distance from offerings and rituals. Food preparation was barred as well, since the act of cooking was entwined with purity and sacrifice. A hand stained by blood was seen as unfit to handle grain or water meant for the sacred flame. Texts like the Manusmriti, a legal and moral code compiled centuries later, went even further. Menstruating women were instructed to sleep on the ground, avoid physical contact with family members, and eat separately. The body, in its bleeding state, was not simply off limits. It was treated as if it carried a contagious ritual force that needed containment through isolation. The rules sound harsh, but their consistency reveals how deeply menstruation was embedded in the architecture of purity. At the same time, South Asian traditions were never entirely one-dimensional. While the mainstream treated menstruation as dangerous, there were undercurrents of reverence. Fertility goddesses embodied the creative potential of blood, and regional practices sometimes linked menstrual cycles to the rhythms of agriculture and lunar rituals. In parts of India, even today, the Ambabachi Mela festival in Assam celebrates the menstruation of the goddess Kamakya, marking the temple's annual closure during her cycle and its reopening as a moment of renewal. Here, blood wasn't pollution. It was divine fertility manifesting in stone. This duality captures the heart of the paradox. The same phenomenon that made women untouchable in kitchens and shrines could sanctify a goddess's temple. Power and pollution lived side by side, with no effort to reconcile them. The woman in the household might be sent to the corner mat, while the goddess in the sanctuary was revered for bleeding on schedule. But South Asia wasn't alone in drawing these sharp lines between impurity and sacredness. Across East Asia, particularly in Japan and China, the same logic shaped ritual boundaries, weaving menstruation into the language of impurity and cosmic disorder. In East Asia, the anxiety around menstruation was written not only into ritual rules, but into the architecture of daily life. It was called many things, but the meaning was consistent. The body and blood was unfit for sacred contact. In Japan, within the Shinto tradition, the term kagari impurity captured the state of menstruation. Kagari was not a moral failure. It was a temporary disruption, a spiritual imbalance that demanded purification. Yet the consequence was the same: exclusion. Women in their cycle were barred from entering shrines. The reasoning was blunt. Menstruation was blood, blood was disorder, and disorder had no place in communion with the kami, the divine spirits who required order to be properly honored. If a woman approached a shrine during her bleeding days, she risked carrying kigari into the sacred space, contaminating the very presence of the gods. Priests codified this boundary, sometimes even questioning women directly at shrine entrances, asking whether their bodies were ritually safe. Imagine a place where divinity supposedly knows all things, yet still needs a human gatekeeper to interrogate your uterus before granting entry. The fear extended beyond shrines. In rural communities, menstruating women were often discouraged from handling food offered to household deities or ancestral spirits. Rice, sake, and salt, staples of sacred offerings, could not pass through hands marked by blood. The logic was circular. Blood brought disorder. Offerings demanded order. Therefore, women in their cycle were banned from the kitchen altar. In China, Confucian codes enforced similar seclusion. The body was seen as a microcosm of the cosmos, and menstruation signaled instability within that order. Ritual manuals described women as needing to avoid ancestral rites during their cycles, lest the ancestors themselves take offense. The household shrine, the spiritual core of the family, was closed to women during this period. At the same time, the domestic sphere tightened around them. Beds, seats, and clothing used during menstruation were sometimes set apart, marked as impure until the bleeding ceased. Purification was the way back. In Japan, ritual washing maisagi reset the body, restoring harmony with the divine. In China, baths and changes of clothing were prescribed, not for cleanliness in the modern sense, but to symbolically erase the stain of liminality. It was never about soap or dirt. It was about boundaries. Blood left the body, so the body itself was reclassified as unsafe, until ritual restored its category. And yet, as in other parts of the world, ambivalence ran deep. Blood was feared as disorder, but it was also linked to life force. Some Taoist texts described menstrual blood as a form of jing, essential vitality, connected to reproduction and cosmic balance. Women were excluded from rituals because their bodies were considered too potent, too charged with uncontained energy. What priests called impurity could also be interpreted as raw sacred force, but force too unruly to be allowed inside the ritual circle. This double logic meant that menstruating women were simultaneously diminished and exalted. In public, they were kept away from shrines, kitchens, and ancestors. In whispers, their bodies were recognized as charged with cosmic energy. The contradiction wasn't resolved. It was institutionalized, cemented into the rhythms of ritual life. And this idea of exile, removing women from ordinary spaces during their cycles, was not limited to East Asia. Across the world, from sub-Saharan Africa to the Americas, societies built separate huts, small dwellings, or ritual spaces where menstruating women were sent to wait out the days, isolated but watched, feared but never ignored. Exile was the simplest answer societies could invent for menstruation. If the body was too unpredictable, too liminal, too terrifyingly sacred to manage within the walls of the home, then send it outside. Separate space, separate rules, separate air. Across continents, the menstrual hut became the architecture of fear and fascination, sometimes a prison, sometimes a sanctuary, often both at once. Among indigenous groups in North America, the Navajo practiced canalda, girls' puberty ceremony that celebrated fertility while simultaneously marking her as set apart. Menstruating women were often placed in small separate dwellings, removed from the family home until their cycle ended. These huts were not decorated temples, they were basic, utilitarian, clay or brush shelters, with little comfort. The logic was unambiguous. Bleeding disrupted the balance of the household, and balance had to be protected. Inside the hut, women cooked separately, and touched only what belonged to them. When the blood ended, ritual purification allowed them to return, as if the exile had temporarily rendered them not quite human. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, similar practices took shape. Among certain groups in Uganda, menstruating women were traditionally excluded from food preparation and sometimes housed in small, separate shelters during their cycles. The community claimed this was protective both for the woman, who was thought to be vulnerable to spirits, and for everyone else, who was supposedly at risk from her ritual heat. Exile here wasn't just about removal, it was about containment. The body was boxed away like fire, dangerous if allowed to spread. In the Andes, among pre-Columbian peoples, menstruating women were also set apart, though the rules varied. Archaeological evidence and Spanish chronicles suggest women were often kept from participating in agricultural work during their cycles. Their absence from the fields was framed as necessary, since menstrual blood was believed to disrupt the fertility of the soil. Some accounts suggest they were also excluded from religious ceremonies, their presence thought to offend the mountain deities. So they waited apart, in small domestic corners or outdoor huts, suspended in ritual quarantine. The irony of these huts is that they often carried a double meaning. To outsiders, they looked like punishment, cramped, dark, isolated, and stigmatizing. But many women also experienced them as temporary refuges from the unrelenting demands of communal life. For a few days, they were excused from cooking, childcare, and labor. The hut became both cage and respite, an ambiguous space where society's fear collided with women's quiet reprieve. Of course, this reprieve was conditional. The moment bleeding ended, the woman was expected to return, purified, ready to resume the obligations that exile had momentarily suspended. Anthropologists note that exile was never just about dirt or health. It was about boundaries. Menstrual blood blurred the neat categories on which ritual life depended: pure and impure, fertile and barren, sacred and profane. By sending women outside, communities reassured themselves that the categories still held. The hut was less about the woman inside and more about the order outside. And yet, even in exile, the body's power was never denied. If anything, the hut magnified it. By isolating menstruating women, communities acknowledged that their bodies carried something potent enough to disturb gods, ancestors, and crops. Exile was fear, yes, but it was also a crooked kind of reverence. The blood was too powerful to ignore, so it was placed beyond reach, visible absence standing in for invisible force. But exile wasn't the only response. In many cultures, the blood itself was harnessed, turned into ritual power. It was collected, whispered over, applied to charms, even invoked as protection against the very forces it was supposed to unleash. If exile was one answer, harnessing the blood itself was another. You can't banish something that refuses to be invisible. So in many cultures, menstrual blood was repurposed, turned from a threat into a tool. It was the ultimate paradox. The same fluid feared for its impurity was also invoked as medicine, protection, and even sorcery. In ancient Rome, writers like Pliny the Elder catalogued beliefs that menstrual blood could repel pests, cure diseases, and neutralize poisons. He claimed that a menstruating woman could make caterpillars fall from crops merely by walking through the fields. Bees would abandon their hives, iron would rust, and dogs would go mad. Yet this chaos could be used strategically. Farmers desperate to clear locusts or beetles from their fields sometimes encouraged women in their cycle to walk the rows, transforming stigma into pest control. Imagine being treated as both a walking curse and the cheapest form of pesticide in the ancient Mediterranean. Similar logics appeared elsewhere. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, ethnographic records describe menstrual blood being applied in protective charms. Hunters smeared it on weapons, believing the blood carried an unmatched potency that would ward off misfortune in the hunt. In some communities, it was hidden in the thresholds of houses to repel evil spirits or ensure enemies would not enter. The very substance feared as pollution inside the home became a shield against intrusion from outside. Among indigenous groups in South America, menstrual blood carried associations with strength and fertility that could be mobilized ritually. Some Amazonian tribes believed it enhanced the potency of magical mixtures or could be used to protect against snake bites. The body's dangerous fluid became a medicine kit in its own right, if handled with care. These uses were rarely public, often whispered and secretive, but they reveal that fear never fully erased respect. Even in medieval Europe, echoes of this duality survived. Folklore claimed that menstrual blood could be used in love potions, binding a lover's will to the woman who gave it. Tucked into food or drink, it was supposed to weave invisible chains of desire. At the same time, it was whispered that the same blood could break curses, serving as an antidote to witchcraft. No priest endorsed it, but no villager completely dismissed it either. People distrusted the body, but they never stopped believing in its hidden arsenal. The contradiction was striking. Menstrual blood was treated as contamination in temples, but as protection in fields and kitchens. It was barred from sacred rites, yet smuggled into folk rituals. The same culture that demanded women be hidden during their cycles sometimes relied on those same women to provide supernatural defense. Society shamed the source, but borrowed the substance whenever it needed a weapon stronger than prayer. This strange alchemy, turning taboo into power, was never entirely comfortable. It left women in a precarious place, feared, needed, but rarely acknowledged openly. Their blood was invoked as cure or curse, but their voices were silenced in deciding how it was used. It was the body speaking without permission, leaking authority into a world that wanted to deny it. And if blood could protect, it could also destroy. Some societies didn't just fear its presence, they wielded it deliberately as a threat, imagining it could bring ruin to enemies and topple the sacred order itself. If protection was one face of the story, cursing was its darker twin. Menstrual blood, feared and revered, became a substance that people swore could topple entire worlds if placed in the wrong hands. It wasn't enough to exile the bleeding body or whisper about its hidden powers. Sometimes it was imagined as the ultimate weapon, a kind of biological sorcery capable of dissolving both enemies and gods. Take the Greeks, for example, who were never shy about cataloguing strange dangers. Alongside their fascination with omens and entrails, they entertained the notion that menstrual blood could corrupt wine, sour crops, and ruin the delicate balance of ritual. But it didn't stop at agriculture. Whispered traditions suggested that enemies could be cursed by slipping menstrual blood into food or drink, poisoning not the body but the spirit. You could live to see another day, but under the shadow of a curse you would never rise free. It was witchcraft by the kitchen ladle. Further east, in Central Asia, accounts from early travelers hint at menstrual blood being used in acts of hostility, not in grand public rituals, but in the small, private wars of village life. A quarrel between neighbors could turn into whispered accusations of women smearing blood on doorways or thresholds, ensuring sickness would enter with the next step. Anthropologists later noted that these beliefs blurred into the realm of everyday social control. If a woman was feared for her supposed ability to curse, people treated her with caution, even deference. The irony was thick, stigmatized as impure, yet treated like an unspoken authority precisely because her blood carried the weight of terror. In parts of West Africa, menstrual blood was imagined as so dangerous that it could undo rituals of kingship if it entered a sacred space. Some oral traditions warned that spilling such blood in a shrine would drive spirits away or even collapse the protection of the ancestors. That fear turned women into potential saboteurs of entire political orders. If you wanted to unseat a rival lineage, rumors about menstrual contamination were more effective than any sword. Medieval Europe, never one to avoid paranoia, folded menstrual blood neatly into the witch-hunting imagination. Trials and pamphlets described it as an ingredient in curses that could blight fields, kill infants, or strip men of their virility. These were not scientific claims, but moral panics dressed up as evidence. A woman's body became proof of guilt simply because it bled, and the blood itself was cast as liquid treason. No wonder men obsessed over keeping it locked away from chalices and altars in their eyes. One drop could undo salvation itself. The broader pattern was consistent. What was feared as pollution was also feared as sabotage, and sabotage is simply pollution applied with intent. The logic was circular but effective. By treating menstrual blood as a weapon, societies maintained their obsession with controlling it, managing it, isolating it. Women themselves bore the burden, accused of wielding a curse, even when they had no interest in doing so. But not all saw it purely in destructive terms. In some cultures, the cycle was framed as a rebirth, a monthly shedding of what could have become life. This liminal quality gave menstruation its terrifying potential, but also its cosmic resonance. It wasn't just a curse, it was a death and life rhythm embodied in flesh. And so, while some feared its power to destroy, others drew connections between menstrual cycles and the cycles of the moon, the tides, and the regeneration of the earth itself. For all the fear of curses and sabotage, there was always another thread woven through the story, the sense that menstruation wasn't just a private bodily event but part of the cosmos itself. Many cultures looked upward and saw the moon waxing and waning, counted the days, and couldn't ignore the fact that the heavens seemed to be bleeding on the same schedule as women. It was too neat a coincidence to dismiss, and so menstrual cycles became entangled with the rhythms of celestial order. In Mesoamerica, for instance, the Aztecs linked menstrual blood to both fertility and sacrifice. They believed that the gods had sustained the cosmos through their own self-wounding, offering blood to keep the sun in motion. Women, therefore, were participating in a parallel sacrifice every month, bleeding not by knife but by nature. Some codices describe menstrual blood as an offering that paralleled the warrior's wound. Both forms of blood were necessary to sustain cosmic balance. The body was a microcosm of the universe, its cycles echoing those of the heavens. In Polynesian traditions, the connection to the moon was even more explicit. Oral histories from Hawaii, for example, describe menstruation as a sign of a woman's alignment with lunar rhythms, each cycle a reflection of the goddess Hina, who was associated with the moon. Women were sometimes restricted from fishing or gathering during their period, not out of disgust, but out of reverence for the fragile balance between moonlight, tides, and fertility. The sea and the womb were imagined as sisters, swelling and receding with the same unseen force. Among indigenous peoples of North America, some groups tied menstrual cycles directly to the new moon. Menstruating women often gathered together in designated lodges during this lunar phase, creating a rhythm of collective retreat that mirrored the waxing and waning sky. Here, menstruation wasn't treated as individual shame but as a synchronized ritual, women stepping aside together, their absence reinforcing the presence of cosmic cycles in community life. The lodge itself became a moon house, a kind of calendar you could enter. Even in ancient Greece, amid all the suspicion and anxiety about menstrual blood's dangers, physicians and philosophers couldn't help but notice the lunar correspondence. Hippocrates and his successors wrote at length about the moon's influence over the womb, imagining the female body as a vessel governed by celestial tides. They interpreted irregular cycles as signs of cosmic imbalance, not just personal illness. Women's bodies, in their view, were walking reflections of lunar harmony or lunar disorder. The irony is hard to miss. What was feared as unclean in temples was revered as cosmic when mapped onto the heavens. Menstrual blood could ruin crops or sour wine, yes, but it could also announce that the body was synchronized with the universe itself. Women were imagined as natural astronomers, their bodies keeping time with the sky in a way no sundial could. But this reverence was slippery. The same cosmic association that sanctified menstruation also reinforced restrictions. If a woman was aligned with the moon, she was also bound by its taboos. No harvesting, no ritual touch, no stepping across thresholds. Cosmic respect doubled as cosmic control. The stars were watching, and the body was only as free as the rules allowed. And yet, even with restrictions, the The alignment with celestial cycles gave menstruation an aura of inevitability. You could exile, curse, or fear it, but you couldn't deny it. The moon would return, the blood would return, and with them, the reminder that women's bodies carried a rhythm no man's decree could erase. From here, the thread unravels into the last theme: how these taboos, cosmic or cursed, managed to survive the ages, lingering in folklore and shaping the modern imagination of purity, pollution, and power. If you think these taboos were neatly buried with the ruins of temples and the fading of old rituals, you'd be mistaken. The fear and fascination with menstrual blood never really vanished. It just disguised itself in new language, slipped into new institutions, and found subtler ways of controlling women's bodies. What was once enforced by priests or shamans is now whispered in classrooms, printed on labels, or coded into polite silences at dinner tables. Take the echoes in South Asia, where menstrual huts, small isolated structures used to banish bleeding women, are officially banned, but still quietly maintained in rural areas. Women are sent away during their periods, told not to cook, not to touch household objects, not to cross certain thresholds. The logic is unchanged from antiquity. The body is imagined as a disruption, a kind of cosmic interference that must be managed through exile. Governments and NGOs call it a human rights violation. Villagers call it tradition. Both are true. Even in Europe, long after the witch trials ended, traces of the old suspicion lingered. Folklore into the 19th century still claimed that menstrual women could spoil butter while churning, or blight a garden simply by walking through it. The words were less formal than in Hippocrates' treatises, but the paranoia was the same. The idea that an ordinary body could sabotage nature's work without even trying. Scientific revolutions rewrote cosmology, but they didn't quite erase these household panics. And in Japan, while Shinto shrines no longer enforce strict exclusion, some rituals and spaces still quietly discourage menstruating women from participating. The language has softened. It's framed as reverence, not impurity, but the principle is ancient. Blood carries a power too disruptive for ritual order. Even when sanitized for modern ears, the taboo survives, humming under the surface. Advertising in the 20th century added its own absurd chapter. Menstrual blood was recast as something to be hidden, deodorized, erased. Commercials showed blue liquid instead of red, as if women were secretly plumbing fixtures rather than living organisms. The fear of pollution was reborn as the fear of disclosure. Better to pretend it wasn't there at all. A modern kind of exile, not to a hut, but to invisibility. Anthropologists note that many of these modern echoes retain the old paradox: menstruation as both dangerous and sacred, feared and yet central to identity. Feminist movements reframed the cycle as a sign of strength, a source of power, or even a tool of resistance. Some activists staged blood protests, deliberately confronting the cultural panic by making the hidden visible. They didn't invent this idea. They simply flipped the script on millennia of whispered anxieties. What survives is not the exact ritual or the same sacred law, but the structure of thought, that a bleeding body must be accounted for, explained, managed. Whether through exile, reverence, or embarrassment, the cycle has always demanded cultural response. Silence itself becomes part of the tradition, the unspoken rule that menstruation belongs outside polite conversation. The truth is, we're never that far from the ancient lodge, the whispered curses, or the lunar metaphors. Every time someone flinches at the mention of a period, or insists it's not the right time for a woman to step into a sacred role, the old taboos flicker back to life. And like the moon they were once tied to, they keep returning, waxing and waning, but never entirely gone. And so the story ends as it began, with a body treated as both miracle and menace, sacred rhythm and dangerous leakage. You can change the words, the rituals, even the gods, but the blood remains, reminding us that history doesn't just sit in ruins, it pulses. In many ancient societies, sound wasn't just sound, it was thought to be a material force, something that could reorder the world if wielded carelessly. A spoken word could summon the gods, curse a neighbor, or unravel the fragile line between order and chaos. And within this noisy metaphysics, there was one voice more suspicious than most, the voice of a woman. Her words were rarely taken as harmless. They were believed to carry a charge, like a storm about to break. In some traditions, the sound of a woman speaking in the wrong place was seen as polluting, not because of its content, but simply because it existed. A cough from her throat could sour the balance of a ritual, bend the crops toward failure, or tempt spirits into mischief, which is a long-winded way of saying she could be standing in her own kitchen, asking for more salt, and be treated as though she'd just sabotaged the harvest. The association of female speech with disorder had deep roots. In Greek thought, silence was listed among the ornaments of a respectable wife, while her chatter was mocked as destructive. Philosophers and dramatists alike warned that women's words could corrode public life, gossip turning into conspiracy, complaint into rebellion. It wasn't the content that mattered, but the imagined effect. Once a woman's voice slipped into the public air, men feared it could never be pulled back in. Similar anxieties drifted eastward. In early Chinese philosophy, the ideal household harmony depended on strict hierarchies, and speech flowed downward like water, from ruler to subject, husband to wife, elder to younger. A woman who spoke outside her allotted turn was not merely rude, but was said to tilt the balance of the cosmos itself. The sound of her tongue, rising where it didn't belong, could set entire families adrift. Even Confucius, usually measured in tone, implied that a woman's words were best kept contained, as though they were smoke that might choke a room. What emerges from these traditions isn't just disdain but fear. The fear that voices, once unchained, might swell into a storm. Ritual systems were especially anxious about this. In certain religious contexts, a woman speaking at the wrong moment was believed to drive away protective spirits or attract dangerous ones. In a world where cosmic order had to be renewed daily through the right chants and invocations, her voice could act like static, crackling through a sacred frequency. The idea wasn't metaphorical, it was frighteningly literal. The irony, of course, is that this paranoia gave women's voices a strange kind of power. If speech from the wrong mouth could bring down rituals, then speech was never neutral. It was treated almost as a weapon, though one that women weren't supposed to wield. The same society that insisted on their silence also, in a backhanded way, admitted their potential for disruption. It was the oldest trick of patriarchy. Fear something, forbid it, then claim the prohibition itself proves the danger. From there, the stage was set for a long history of silencing. What began as a cosmological anxiety, the belief that sound could spoil the order of the universe, hardened into social rules, legal codes, and daily habits. A woman's voice was not simply an expression, it was disorder in audible form. Better to press it down, smother it, and exile it to whispers within the household. And yet, the deeper irony lurks here. When you banish a sound, you only make it more haunting. Because while women were being told to keep silent, entire cultures were about to invent elaborate ideals of female quietude, polishing silence into a virtue and speech into a crime. Once the suspicion of female speech had sunk deep enough, it grew into something far more insidious. Silence itself was no longer just expected, it was rebranded as a moral quality. To be silent wasn't simply to obey, it was to embody virtue. In other words, if a woman didn't talk, she wasn't just behaving well, she was supposedly proving her purity. The Greeks, who adored carving ideals into stone, did the same with women's tongues. Xenophon, in his model of a proper household, described the good wife as one who stayed indoors and spoke little, her voice carefully kept from public ears. Athenian playwrights pushed this further, poking fun at the chatter of women as though it were a social contagion. The public woman, the one whose words were overheard in the marketplace or council, was immediately coded as shameless. Speech itself became a kind of clothing. To be quiet was to be properly dressed, while to be heard was to be exposed. The Romans, great absorbers of Greek ideals, picked up the theme and made it legal. A respectable matron was praised for her modesty, and modesty began at the mouth. Her speech was supposed to flow gently inside the household, never outward into the courts or assemblies. Roman moralists went so far as to warn that a woman who spoke too much in public was inviting dishonor upon her family. And dishonor wasn't an abstract thing. It could ruin marriage alliances, damage inheritances, and ripple through generations. Imagine being told that your words at a dinner table might bankrupt your grandchildren. Elsewhere, silence was elevated into full-blown philosophy. In ancient India, for instance, the Manusmriti prescribed that women, like children and servants, were to be constantly guided by men, and that speech outside those boundaries was a lapse in dharma, the proper order of things. A woman who spoke out of turn was not only breaking decorum, but was believed to be fraying the cosmic fabric itself. Here again, speech was not personal expression, but a force with consequences far beyond the household. The aesthetic of silence also seeped into everyday proverbs. Across cultures, sayings praised the quiet woman while mocking the talkative one. Silence was equated with chastity, wisdom, obedience, chatter with lust, foolishness, rebellion. To stay mute was to stay safe, to hold the household's reputation intact. It wasn't that women were born with fewer words. It was that their words were systematically shaved down until silence looked natural. And, of course, this logic was incredibly convenient. If silence equaled virtue, then breaking silence equaled sin. No need for lengthy arguments or proof. If a woman raised her voice, her very act condemned her. Silence became not only a strategy of control, but also a trap of circular reasoning. She who is quiet is good. She who is not quiet is bad. Case closed. What's remarkable is how this virtue of silence was dressed up as protection. Men insisted that keeping women quiet was for their own good, shielding them from the dangers of exposure. But protection and confinement are often the same thing, merely lit from different angles. Behind the poetic talk of modesty was the blunt reality of silencing. Women weren't allowed to speak because men didn't want them to. This moralization of quietness seeped so deeply into the cultural bloodstream that it shaped entire legal systems. Laws that barred women from speaking in assemblies, councils, and courts were simply extensions of this virtue. After all, if silence was the highest good, what better gift could society give them than the opportunity to embody it at every waking moment? And yet, the irony persisted. By insisting on silence as virtue, societies also created the conditions for speech to become dangerous. Because once words are forbidden, they acquire a strange electricity. A whisper can carry more weight than a speech. Which is why the next step wasn't just about silencing women in daily life, but making sure that, even when truth was at stake, their voices stayed legally inaudible. Once silence was dressed up as a virtue, it didn't take long for lawmakers to make it mandatory. After all, what better way to enforce morality than to codify it? Across the ancient world, the principle was remarkably consistent. A woman's tongue had no legal standing, which was just a tidy way of saying her voice didn't matter. Take classical Athens, that birthplace of democracy, where every free man supposedly had a say. Women, not even close. They weren't allowed to participate in the assembly, couldn't vote, and couldn't address the courts. Their testimony was considered unreliable, needing a male guardian to stand in for them. In practice, this meant that even if a woman was the only witness to a crime, her words evaporated into thin air unless echoed by a man. Democracy was apparently too fragile to withstand the sound of a woman's voice. Rome followed with its own legal silences. Women could technically inherit property and wield influence in the private sphere, but in courtrooms their words carried little weight. A matron might own estates, manage slaves, and run finances. Yet, if she tried to stand in as a witness, her testimony could be dismissed on the grounds of gender. Roman jurists liked to justify this by calling women light-minded or to swayed by emotion, as though all male senators were paragons of stoic logic rather than backstabbing gossip machines. Farther east, in early Chinese dynasties, the codes of propriety went beyond law into ritual etiquette. Women of rank were carefully instructed on when, how, and to whom they could speak. Court ladies were expected to whisper rather than speak plainly, their voices like background music rather than instruments of persuasion. Legal texts didn't always spell it out, but the principle was the same. A woman's role was to harmonize silently, not to disrupt with opinion. In early Jewish law, women's testimony in religious courts was also restricted. They could not serve as formal witnesses in many cases, particularly those involving capital punishment. Rabbis debated whether this was because women were too merciful or because public speaking would tarnish their modesty. Either way, it was another variation on the global theme. Her silence protected not her, but the fragile authority of men. Even where laws allowed exceptions, they were narrow and strategic. A widow might be allowed to speak in court over matters of inheritance, but only because her absence would leave a legal vacuum. A slave woman could testify under torture, but her words alone still weren't considered sufficient. The very act of requiring male corroboration was a neat trick. It allowed lawmakers to pretend women weren't silenced while ensuring that their voices never truly stood alone. And here's the irony that runs like a thread. The louder the society praised itself for fairness, the stricter the rules became around women's speech. Athenian democracy prided itself on equality, but only among men. Roman law claimed universality, but only for male citizens. Each system hid behind a veil of reason and virtue, while quietly bolting the doors against half the population. Of course, these laws weren't just about courts and councils. They bled into daily life, reinforcing the idea that women who spoke in public were breaking both etiquette and legality. The household, the marketplace, the assembly, each had its own invisible no-speech signs posted for women, and those signs carried real consequences. Speak when you shouldn't, and it wasn't just gossip you risked. It was censure, ridicule, even exile. The legal muzzle, once fixed, didn't stop at testimony. It stretched into rituals, prayers, and chants, because speech wasn't only about law, it was also about the sacred. Which is why the next battleground over women's voices was not the courtroom, but the temple. If law silenced women in the courts, ritual did the same in temples, often with even more flair. Words weren't just words in the ancient world. They were spells, incantations, vibrations that could reorder the cosmos. Which meant, of course, that whoever controlled speech controlled reality itself. And, predictably, men decided they were the only safe custodians of sacred sound. In Vedic India, the performance of ritual was all about precision, the pitch of the chant, the rhythm of the syllables, the breath breaking at just the right point. Priests guarded this knowledge like a vault, declaring that women were unfit to handle such cosmic responsibility. The logic was always dressed in lofty terms. Their voices were unstable, their cycles unpredictable, their presence disruptive. But underneath it, there was simply the old, universal anxiety. What if a woman, with her own mouth, bent the gods to listen? Something similar unfolded in ancient Israel, where the temple cult in Jerusalem barred women from the priestly role of offering sacrifices or leading prayers. To speak in the sacred assembly was a male prerogative. Women could sing laments in carefully controlled settings at funerals, in the background of ritual processions, but never in the place of formal proclamation. The divine word, they insisted, had to arrive through the steady voice of men. Otherwise, who knew what chaos might break loose? And yet, exceptions flickered like cracks in the wall. Think of the oracles in Greece. At Delphi, it was a woman who sat on the tripod, inhaled the fumes, and let Apollo's voice spill from her lips. But notice the setup. She wasn't allowed to speak in her own right. Her words were interpreted by male priests, rephrased into orderly sentences. The god was speaking, not the woman, a loophole that allowed them to use her body as a vessel, while still denying her agency. It was ventriloquism disguised as prophecy. Egypt, with its sprawling temples and elaborate rituals, occasionally allowed priestesses to take part in festivals or music-making. But when it came to the high speech, the sacred recitation of cosmic order, the declarations that tethered Pharaoh to the gods, men monopolized the role. Even the goddess Isis, famous for her cunning words and spells, was invoked through male priests, as though her power needed a masculine filter to be palatable. The rationale was always dressed in piety. Sacred speech, they said, required stability, and women were too changeable. Their voices were unpredictable, their moods too dangerous, their presence likely to disturb the fragile balance between the human and divine. But peel away the metaphysics, and it looks suspiciously like another old trick. Use religion to reinforce what law and custom had already achieved. Silence wasn't just a virtue now. It was an offering, a condition of spiritual order. And this is where the story takes a darker turn. Because if women's everyday chatter could be inconvenient, their unsanctioned words could be catastrophic. Rumor, gossip, incantation, all of these could destabilize households, kingdoms, and even the favor of the gods. Which is why the next step in this long history was to brand the female voice itself as dangerous, a tongue that could curse, hex, or unravel the world with nothing more than a whisper. There's a strange irony in the ancient fear of women's voices. The same societies that tried to shut them up were the ones most convinced that a single syllable from a woman's mouth could topple kingdoms. If silence was virtue, then speech was sorcery. And nowhere was this clearer than in the way gossip and incantation blurred together. Take medieval Europe, for instance. A woman muttering to herself over herbs, or humming while stirring a pot, could suddenly be branded as a witch, not because she was plotting with demons, but because her voice, low, secretive, rhythmic, looked suspiciously like spellcraft. Everyday words were dangerous. An insult could fester into a curse, a song into an omen. Courts of law and inquisitors alike recorded case after case where neighbors accused women of bewitching cows or children with nothing more than a passing phrase. But the suspicion wasn't just European. In parts of West Africa, women's songs held the power to shame men publicly, and that power made them suspect. To sing mockingly at a warrior was more than humiliation. It was a curse, a stripping of status. Among the Igbo, for example, certain ritual songs performed by women were believed to summon spirits or bend fortune, a talent that men often sought to control and feared when they couldn't. Here, gossip wasn't idle chatter. It was a sharpened weapon, carrying consequences in both the social and spiritual spheres. And in early Rome, the very idea of Defixione's curse tablets thrived on the belief that words, once spoken or scratched into lead, could bind or harm. Though men certainly participated in this ritual economy of cursing, women were disproportionately accused of deploying it in secret. A murmured spell in the marketplace, a heated argument turned sour, could be reframed as magical assault. The tongue, quick and invisible, was imagined as more dangerous than the dagger. It's telling that in so many traditions, women were thought to wield power precisely through what they were denied elsewhere: language. If they couldn't argue in the courts, they might whisper in the shadows. If they couldn't speak in the temple, they might sing in kitchens or fields. Every forbidden space became a potential workshop for clandestine speech, which is why the punishments were so severe: exile, public shaming, or, in the most extreme cases, execution. But beneath the paranoia lies something almost comical. Entire legal codes were constructed on the idea that the world might collapse if a woman talked too much. Think about that. Empires that managed to conquer vast territories, build monumental architecture, and invent sophisticated systems of law were terrified of gossip in the next room. It wasn't the spear that would undo them, but the whisper. And whispers, of course, had a way of traveling. A complaint passed from one mouth to another could become a rumor. A rumor could become sedition, and soon enough the ruling class was trembling. Which is why the next stage of control didn't just demand silence inside temples or courts. It moved straight into the household, binding the tongue at the most intimate level. If public silence was about protecting the city or the gods, private silence was about protecting men's egos, and those, as history demonstrates, are far more fragile than temples. The household, that miniature kingdom of brick and dust, became the first arena where women's voices were strangled, not with laws or curses, but with the slow weight of daily expectation. In ancient Athens, the word for respectable woman was practically synonymous with quiet one. A wife's virtue was measured not by her sharp mind or quick tongue, but by how little the neighbors heard her. To be discreet wasn't just preferred, it was demanded. The domestic walls were her boundaries, and silence was her greatest ornament. Male orators could debate politics for hours in the agora, but if a wife dared to weigh in over dinner, she risked being treated as disruptive, even shameful. China's Confucian tradition codified this expectation with elegance. The 3 obediences and 4 virtues held that a woman must obey her father, her husband, and her son, in that order, and that one of her core virtues was speech restraint. Manuals for proper female conduct advised wives to keep their voices soft, their words minimal, and their opinions practically invisible. To speak too freely was not just improper, it was a failure of character. A talkative woman was seen as a domestic hazard, a source of conflict, like keeping firewood stacked too close to the hearth. And in early Islamic jurisprudence, while women did hold rights to property and legal recourse, the ideal of the modest, restrained voice emerged strongly in household ethics. Male commentators often stressed that a woman's words carried a kind of provocative danger. Her voice itself could stir desire, disrupt order. So even when not legally silenced, women were socially urged toward verbal discretion, their speech reduced to whispers behind lattice screens. But it wasn't always soft advice. In parts of medieval Europe, husbands could enforce silence quite literally. The infamous scold's bridle, a metal contraption fitted over the head with a spiked bit pressing against the tongue, was used on women accused of nagging or gossiping. Imagine the horror. A household quarrel answered with public humiliation. Her body paraded through the streets like a warning. Domestic silence here wasn't just encouraged, it was hammered in iron. What's striking is how this domestic suppression is often masqueraded as protection. Women were told that silence preserved harmony, that their quiet preserved the dignity of the household. Yet behind the rhetoric was a deep unease. Men feared being ridiculed, undermined, or simply reminded that their power wasn't absolute. Silence wasn't about peace, it was about control. And once the household became a training ground for silence, it was only natural that the model extended outward to fields, villages, and entire kingdoms. The next step in this long choreography was to turn silence itself into a public performance. The expectation that women's very presence in ritual or ceremony would be expressed not through words, but through muteness, absence, or carefully orchestrated stillness. If the household demanded quiet obedience, ritual demanded something more theatrical, silence as spectacle. In many traditions, women were welcome to participate in ceremony, but only if they brought their tongues as empty offerings. Their silence wasn't a passive absence, it was a choreographed act, a public reminder that their voices belonged elsewhere. In Hindu ritual practice, for example, women's roles were often carefully scripted. A wife could sit beside her husband during a sacrifice, yet she was forbidden to utter the chants herself. The hymns belonged to the male priests, while the woman's contribution was her mute presence, symbolic of cosmic support, but stripped of verbal agency. She might grind the grain, pour the water, or arrange the offerings, but her lips were sealed, her silence counted as piety. To speak during the wrong moment was thought to corrupt the ritual, like ash spilling into pure milk. In pre-Columbian Central America, silence also shaped ceremonial life. During menstruation, women were not just removed from certain rituals. They were considered too charged with sacred energy to participate vocally in communal rites. A woman's voice at such times was thought to disrupt the delicate balance between the living and the divine. Instead of chanting, she might be confined to the edges of the settlement, her silence serving as both exclusion and protection. Sacred power, it seemed, was too dangerous to risk escaping through words. Japan's Shinto traditions offered their own version. Women could serve at shrines, tending to sacred spaces and rituals, but their voices were circumscribed. Formal recitation of Narito prayers was reserved for male priests, while women's contributions leaned toward the silent labor of purification, sweeping, arranging, waiting. Their stillness itself became part of the liturgy, an embodied contrast to the rhythmic chanting of men. And in Catholic convents, silence wasn't merely encouraged, but ritualized. Cloistered nuns took vows that bound their voices, sometimes allowing speech only during designated hours. The hush of the convent was described as an offering to God, an echo of the Virgin Mary's humility. Yet this devotional quiet also served another purpose. It contained women's intellectual and spiritual energies within walls where they could not trouble the male hierarchy. All of this reveals a paradox. The very ceremonies designed to connect humans with gods, moments of collective exaltation. Words rising like smoke into the sky, often demanded that women contribute through absence. Their muteness was considered part of the sacred order, as essential as the incense or the chant. To break that silence wasn't just rude, it was profane. And once silence took on this aura of holiness, it bled back into social law. If women's quiet was sacred in ritual, then their speech in ordinary life could be cast as profane, even dangerous. Which is why the line between temple and courtroom, shrine and street, was thinner than it seemed. The voice that was too holy for ritual was soon declared too risky for public debate. If rituals trained women to swallow their words, the law made sure the lesson stuck. Courtrooms across civilizations became echo chambers for male voices, where women were often cast not as speakers but as evidence. Bodies on display, never mouths that testified. Silence was woven into legal structures, not as an accident, but as a deliberate method of trimming female presence from the civic stage. In early Germanic law codes, for instance, a woman's word in legal disputes carried half the weight of a man's, if it was allowed at all. Her voice was measured like watered-down wine, less potent, less trustworthy, less binding. The assumption was not that she might lie more icily, but that her testimony itself was unstable, like a roof beam made from soft wood. She could not swear an oath on her own without a male guardian to reinforce it. as if truth required a masculine backbone to stand upright. In ancient Hebrew tradition, legal testimony followed a similar hierarchy. Women were frequently barred from serving as witnesses in court, especially in cases requiring formal contracts or public disputes. The rationale was simple and circular. Women lived largely within the domestic sphere. Therefore, they were considered unfit to speak on matters beyond it. Their silence wasn't proof of unreliability, it was proof of their social invisibility. And so the law institutionalized the very muteness it demanded. Medieval Europe brought its own innovations in quieting female voices. A noblewoman might own land or inherit titles, but her ability to testify in court was constrained by her gender. In some regions, she was explicitly prohibited from speaking in public assemblies unless she represented her absent husband. Imagine it, a landowner in her own right, yet still only permitted to open her mouth as a stand-in, never as herself. The legal fiction of representation reduced her to a vessel, words passing through her, never originating from her. Islamic jurisprudence, too, codified the asymmetry. In certain schools of law, 2 female witnesses were required to equal 1 male witness in cases involving contracts. The reasoning often invoked was pragmatic. Women were thought to be less experienced in financial matters, yet the effect was unmistakable. Even when present, their voices arrived already discounted, diminished before they were spoken. But perhaps the most chilling example comes from the witch trials of early modern Europe. Women accused of sorcery were silenced in the most grotesque way. Their voices, when raised in protest, were treated as evidence of guilt. Denial became self-incrimination. A woman's very attempt to defend herself was twisted into proof that the devil spoke through her. In these courts, silence wasn't just imposed, it became the only safe option. A thin hope that muteness might be mistaken for piety rather than rebellion. Across all these systems, law pretended to be the domain of rationality and order. Yet its handling of women's speech revealed something closer to fear. Fear that words from the wrong mouth might unravel authority itself. And if courts could strip women of their right to speak, then schools, councils, and guilds would follow naturally, ensuring that silence became not only a legal condition, but an educational inheritance. The law may have muzzled women in public, but the classroom or whatever passed for one ensured the habit took root before adulthood. From childhood onward, instruction often came with an unspoken lesson: know when not to speak. Silence was rehearsed, practiced, and drilled until it became second nature, the invisible curriculum shaping generations. In Confucian-influenced East Asia, female education was often summarized in a single formula: obedience, modesty, quietness. Manuals such as Lessons for Women instructed daughters to cultivate humility and keep their speech measured, lest words betray the family's honor. A girl who chattered freely was seen as ungoverned, dangerous even, like a horse that bolted from the stable. Her training was less about arithmetic or rhetoric, more about perfecting the art of swallowing words before they escaped. In the Indian subcontinent, treatises like the Manusmriti sketched the same outlines. Women were encouraged to study domestic skills, but warned against the temptation of debate or intellectual competition. Knowledge that required speech belonged to men. The clever daughter, if she could not restrain herself, was expected at least to keep her insights within the walls of her household, never spilling them into public air. Education for women often resembled a locked chest, useful in private, but dangerous if opened outside. Medieval Europe refined this into the culture of convent schooling. Girls of noble families were sometimes placed in religious houses, where they learned reading, needlework, and scripture under strict vows of silence. To learn was permitted. To speak about learning was suspect. Even letters were censored, written under supervision so that the ink itself could not carry forbidden opinions into the world. Knowledge was rationed, like bread, and silence was the plate it was served on. In the Ottoman Empire, elite women were educated within the harem, shielded from public intellectual life. Here, silence was both literal and symbolic. Women might master poetry, music, or calligraphy, but these arts were cultivated in private salons rather than public forums. Education became ornament rather than authority, a way to beautify domestic spaces rather than challenge civic ones. The voice, once again, was trained to remain inside. And then there were oral traditions, where silence carried its own peculiar weight. Among certain African societies, initiation rituals for girls included periods of seclusion in which speaking was prohibited. Instruction came through song, gesture, or whispered teaching by elder women, but the initiates themselves were expected to listen, not respond. Silence during these rites wasn't just training in self-control. It was a symbolic rehearsal for adult life, where speaking too freely could trigger censure, exile, or worse. Across all these contexts, education revealed itself as less about literacy than about discipline. It taught women not just what they could know, but how they must remain quiet about it. To be well educated, in many societies, meant to know precisely how not to sound educated. That contradiction shaped generations, ensuring that silence was not only socially enforced but self-inflicted, passed down like a family heirloom. And once silence became part of a girl's training, it shadowed her into marriage, where the next stage of her muteness would be tested, not in classrooms, but in bedrooms and family councils. By the time a woman reached marriage, silence had become more than habit. It was her dowry, the invisible wealth she carried into the union. Husbands received land, livestock, or coins with one hand, and with the other, they received a wife whose tongue was meant to remain tucked away like fine silverware, present, valuable, but rarely brought out in public. In South Asia, prescriptive texts didn't shy from spelling this out. A wife's speech was supposed to be soft, limited, deferential, ideally heard only by her husband and children. Words spoken outside the home were likened to spilling oil, wasteful, messy, and impossible to gather back. Silence was treated as the mark of chastity, the guarantee that a woman's voice wouldn't stir scandal or suspicion in the community. In Renaissance Europe, marriage vows might not literally demand muteness, but the social contract assumed it. Manuals for wives instructed them to speak rarely, never contradict their husbands, and certainly never voice opinions in mixed company. To be talkative was to be quarrelsome, and to be quarrelsome was to be dangerous. The good wife was quiet, not because she lacked thoughts, but because her silence proved her loyalty. Her voice was the one part of her body her husband was expected never to share with others. Among certain indigenous North American groups, silence within marriage carried spiritual overtones. A wife's words during quarrels were believed to summon misfortune, bringing disharmony not just to the household but to the wider community. Silence was framed as a protective force, a shield against chaos. Though the effect was the same, the woman carried the burden of keeping balance by withholding her voice. In imperial China, marriage contracts and clan codes extended the logic of silence into law. A wife who criticized her husband or his parents could be accused of disobedience, grounds for punishment, or even expulsion from the household. Speech became a liability clause, tucked into the fine print of family life. A single outburst could undo her security, her status, even her survival. And in parts of the Islamic world, while women could wield influence within domestic and familial spaces, their voices were still often bound by the invisible contract of marriage. Public speech was discouraged, and in many cases, their testimony in legal matters was given less weight than men's. Silence thus became both symbolic and practical, a daily reminder that marriage meant agreeing not only to share a home but to relinquish a voice. Marriage, in so many settings, acted as the culmination of all earlier lessons. Silence in the household, silence in ritual, silence in law, silence in education. By the time vows were exchanged, the woman's muteness wasn't just expected, it was formalized, sanctified, and reinforced as her lifelong role. And so the cycle closed neatly. The bride entered her new home not simply as a wife, but as a practiced custodian of silence, her voice buried beneath the weight of contracts, rituals, and expectations. What began as childhood training ended as lifelong performance, binding women into a social order where to speak was always to risk banishment.